Go through the open, like, man, I was really bad at that, endurance test. The same thing in quarterfinals.
The shuttle run test,
exactly,
right?
Yeah. The problem that's holding them back is not necessarily, it is endurance, but that's not the first thing that needs to be fit.
You've got your heart and your lungs, that's your cardiovascular system, or cardiorespiratory, whatever you want to call it. And then you have muscular endurance.
What about my execution? What if I'm Mr. Goes Out Hot guy? Does that impact the result?
It's interesting.
It's a good question. Let's flesh this out a little bit.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is you can do that for 10 years.
Right.
And it's still not going to get any better. You might get a little bit faster, but it's still not going to get better. And then there's a group of people that are like, oh yeah, I've got great endurance. But then you run some testing and you're like, wait, you have great endurance in what?
People say,
I love it.
I knew.
Or they say, I'm like, who's they?
People say they really miss and really have enjoyed our very educational style episodes.
Who says that?
Well, I'll be double dog durned.
I'm asking, who says that?
Well, let me be double dog durned first. I'll be double dog durned if this isn't one of those episodes.
Yeah, let's go.
Well said.
I'll clip this in at the front of this podcast too. So if you're hearing it there, this is also at the end. But let's do something different. And for this episode, as you listen to it, come up with some questions, put them down in the comments, and let's come back and do answer everyone's questions about this episode specifically.
I love that.
I like that idea.
We have Mr. Kyle Ruth on. He's the head of our education here at Training Think Tank, and we're talking about why you're not enduring and what to do about it. I think most people get through this season in particular, you go through the open, like, man, I was really bad at that, endurance test. The same thing in quarterfinals.
The shuttle run test,
exactly,
right?
Yeah.
If you're not enduring, you got done with the shuttle run test, kind of like I was.
What is going on?
Yeah, I thought I was fit, but apparently not.
Ooh, here's a question. Let me already interrupt the flow. Hey, when you get your individual clients, right? Not the people in Compete. When you get your individual clients, you're doing your consult. When they're talking to you about their fitness, do most people, are they tuned into this? Most people say, hey, I'm not very enduring? Is that something you hear a lot?
So it's interesting.
It's a good question. Let's flesh this out a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there are definitely people who know that they are or are not enduring relative to CrossFit. So they know, when it's simple movements like double unders and burpees and box jumps and rowing and shuttle runs and things like that, I crush the workout, or those absolutely demolish me. There are a subset of people who know that. And then there's a group of people that are like, oh yeah, I've got great endurance. But then you run some testing and you're like, wait, you have great endurance in what?
Shots fired. Well, is it because people, that begs the question, what's endurance and how are you defining it?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I think that is
I'm 2 for 2. Let's go.
He's crushing it today. Chris on fire.
Okay, so I look at endurance as a 2-part system, all right? You've got your heart and your lungs, that's your cardiovascular system or your cardiorespiratory, whatever you want to call it. And then you have muscular endurance. So if I'm going to go out and run, as an example, my heart and lungs are going to pick up oxygen and they're going to push it into my muscles. So my muscles are doing the actual work. So I could be someone who has really good cardiorespiratory endurance, but really bad what we call local muscular endurance. CrossFit calls it stamina.
So what happens to that person on a run?
So they start running, and let's say they hit a hill, and they hit the hill, and they're breathing fine, their heart rate's fine, but their legs become absolute bricks, and they basically
people are listening and that's me.
They come to a grinding halt in the middle of the run. Now, I'm not saying they're stopping, but their legs blow up.
Right.
Okay, so that is a good example of someone who would have high cardiovascular endurance and low stamina or low muscular endurance. The flip side of that, where I think a lot of CrossFitters fall in, and people that are bodybuilders and things like that, they tend to have good stamina because the way that they train, they build up a lot of local muscular endurance, but haven't spent a lot of time building that cardiorespiratory, that cardiovascular system.
Yeah.
And so when they're running, everything feels like they're basically either suffocating and they can't breathe or their heart rate just jacks through the roof. And, they're running up the hill and they're doubled over, holding onto their chest, basically having that
it feels like they're running at elevation when they're at sea level.
What are you, Brannen, at this point now?
I actually don't know. I was thinking about that when you were talking. My training has changed, by the way, for everyone that's listening. I just am not training at a high level anymore. 3 kids at home, focused on
coaching. Still beat everyone listening to this podcast, though.
Not maybe at just a basic CrossFit workout.
Fit.
And you can run still too.
Yeah, but I'm finding limitations that I didn't used to find, and I think it's just because I'm undertrained. So that definitely is the case. I always have been limited by, you're not going to believe this, but by the local endurance. I have always felt really confident going into certain workouts, but then always limited by a certain bottleneck, grip endurance, maybe it's lat endurance or leg endurance on a bike workout, those kind of things.
So I think I have the exact opposite problem, or at least had. As I've gotten deeper into CrossFit, I've become more balanced, where now it's test dependent what I'm going to feel.
Right.
But for the longest time, everything just felt like I was suffocating. Like every workout that I would do, I'd be like, oh man, a coach, whether it was Max or Adam, whoever was coaching me at the time, would be like, well, what was the bottleneck for you? What was the limiter? And I was like, my breathing. I couldn't breathe. I got 5 minutes into the workout and I felt like I couldn't breathe. So for me, it really was most likely like a cardiorespiratory.
So what percentage of beginners to intermediates that y'all have coached throughout y'all's 10, 12 years are cardiovascular versus local
stamina or muscular endurance?
Yeah.
It's got to be pretty close to 50-50. And I think most of it has to do with your training background. So if you're someone who, your CrossFit journey was you started out, you ran in high school, you did, cross country and track, maybe you played soccer and then you went and maybe you played even a little bit of college soccer. And then afterward you dabbled in some 5Ks and maybe a half marathon here or there. So you have a, pretty extensive endurance background. You've done long, slow endurance work. You've spent time running intervals on, the soccer field and things like that. Those type of people tend to have amazing cardiovascular systems, but they often aren't strong enough or have the local muscular endurance to be able to move, 95-pound overhead squats or 135-pound overhead squats for men and women. So that's where they tend to struggle. But then you have the people who played college football or a sprint swimmer, or, they come from the other side and they have done a lot of muscular endurance work. They've done a lot of strength work and just by the nature of the sports that they've played, have done a lot of that, but have done hardly any cardiovascular training, like real sustained longer endurance work. And as a result, they definitely tend to fall on the high stamina, low cardiorespiratory endurance.
Totally. Now I want to kind of have a third way here, because this is what I've seen happen in the sport. People come in and the first conversation I have is that they're not enduring, but the problem that's holding them back is not necessarily, it is endurance, but that's not the first thing that needs to be fixed. It's actually the skills in the sport that are holding them back. So
order of operations.
The order of operations, yeah. So I just want to have that as like a caveat with everything that we talk about today. Yes, it would be wonderful if you could crush all the skills. You're great at, you have great movement efficiency with muscle ups and toes to bar and chest to bar and all those things. And then you just need to work on your endurance. But a lot of these, it's more complicated than just building your endurance if someone doesn't have good ring muscle ups or good handstand push-ups. And so they get into workouts and they're breathing really hard. Yes, but that's because they're holding their breath the entire time they're doing handstand push-ups because they have bad shoulder positions.
There's an easy way to think about this using rowing as an example.
Okay.
Right? So if you think about the guy who's on the rower who he has the most atrocious rowing mechanics that you've ever seen, right? The rounded back at the front. They're basically just using all arms. Their legs are barely doing anything. Like the
There's
rower.
me at the end of a workout.
Yes, but everyone, so if you're at your gym, there's got to be some person there that like you
Ricky
watch them
the
row.
rower.
Yeah, Ricky the rower. You're watching them and you're like, man, I think I could help them. And you have limited experience on the rower. So like that person may be able to they may actually have amazing endurance, but they can't express it on the rower because their technique is so bad. That person might be like close to world-class 5K runner, but you put them on a rower, and because their mechanics are so atrocious, they can barely get the rower under 2 minutes for a 5K. Right. So it's like they have this massive engine, what we would call an engine, but they have no ability to express it. And that is the foundation of performance, of using your engine in a sport. And CrossFit just happens to have like 36 different things
you have to be good at all of these things.
And so there is this underlying base of technical proficiency that's absolutely required for you to be good at expressing your engine in the sport, regardless of what your physiological limiter is, whether it's your stamina limiting or your endurance limiting. That's the most basic. Yeah.
And I think that that's also the way that you have to look at this is we're going to talk about endurance today, but if you're like the person, I can't do muscle ups well, or I don't have good technique. This is even a better example. You talk about the rower, but maybe they have really good technique running. So if they were to do a VO2 test on just running versus rowing versus biking, there may be different limitations that come up. Someone that gets on an echo bike for the first time, their legs are burning really bad because they have bad technique on it, or they're using their arms more than their legs, vice versa, whatever. Skier, they can't put the same amount of power. It depends on what their weight is. All of those things, there's so many variables here. So we're talking about this overarching theme of endurance, but just keep in mind when you're in a sport like this where there are so many different movements that you have to be good at, you got to kind of make sure that you're touching all of these pieces.
So what's our starting point, right? So we have someone who comes to us and we test them, and it's very clear that they're cardiovascularly limited. What's the starting point for someone, for you, when you get to that point?
Yeah, well, let's talk about the problem first. Like,
Sure.
How does someone identify that without a coach? Because again,
good point.
The person comes to us and they may say that they aren't enduring or they are enduring. And over the last 3 years, what they've done is they've gone into class and just keep hitting hard Metcon after hard Metcon after hard Metcon. And there is a point where you probably can get better at that particular movement, or the combination of movements that is a CrossFit workout. They got better at all the benchmarks, but they still feel like they're missing something. There's a limiting factor when it's just doing hard CrossFit all the time. In other words, your ceiling can only go so high. So maybe you're down here and you slowly kind of reach up to your ceiling and then you get there, but you're still going to hit that ceiling at some point. And then that's when they usually come to us. So that's the first thing. I think people always rush into...
God, that's the truth. That's usually when they come to us.
And that's a good thing, right? Because
Yeah.
now we can actually raise that ceiling. Like, oh, you're not finished. Like, this isn't the end of the road for you. You haven't tapped your potential.
Yeah, the story is someone gets to, they've improved in the Open every single year to the point that now they're just outside the cut line,
Yes, there we
qualifying
go.
for whether it's quarters or qualifying for semifinals or whatever it might be. They're like, man, I've tried everything that I know to get here, right? So that's usually where people start with us. So really the easiest way for you to assess, where you might be, what your limiter might be, would be to test a variety of CrossFit workouts, right? And just take note. Pay
And isn't
attention.
that black and white, by the way? So we presented these two options, but is there a lot of gray area there, or?
It's absolutely test dependent, right? So when you come down to testing, this is why I say you have to test a variety of CrossFit workouts, right? You can't just get on the rower and test a 5K row and be like, oh, well, all I felt was my heart rate spike and I felt limited by my breathing, so I'm cardiovascularly limited. Right. But what happens when you're doing, say, a 15-minute AMRAP of row thruster? Now, are you entirely limited by your heart rate and breathing? Or someone like you might have been more limited by like local fatigue in the legs from the thruster, or pressing out the thruster.
So in this case, we're looking more often than not, I'm cardio, or more often than not, I'm local muscular.
Across the board, do I tend to be more cardiovascularly limited, or do I tend to be more locally limited? And it's going to be test dependent. And that's why it requires you to test a variety of different things rather than just one. Now, if you're someone who has, 6 or 7 years of experience in the sport, you probably are going to start to have a pretty good sense of what your where you might need to focus your attention. Because at this point, you've done 7 opens, which ones you tend to perform well in. It's like, well, if it's got squatting, my legs are going to blow up for sure. Well, that tells you right there, you got to work on your leg stamina no matter what, right? But then you're like, but also when I was in the shuttle workout, my cardiovascular system was blowing up. Okay, cool. Well, we also have to work on, building some cardiovascular endurance on the other side. So I think that's kind of where my starting process is. It starts with a conversation, then some varied testing, or at least looking at results from the past year or past years and asking people about, what do you feel? You can ask yourself that right now. When you think back to all the open and quarters workouts that you've done, what did you feel? What did you feel like held you back? Well, whatever that thing that really sticks out to you the most is, that's probably a good starting place.
Yeah. I also like to actually have them send me videos so that I can watch them in the workout. This is not necessarily scientific, but it allows me to be able to see how they're moving, which is, the eye test is actually pretty powerful in that if you could see right away if someone has really bad, let's say thruster technique, they're doing a workout with throwing in thrusters, which Kyle alluded to. If someone has really bad positions, an easy fix, it's not going to improve their endurance, right? But I can improve their positions to allow them to express endurance better when we start training it by cleaning up a front rack position or their squatting position while they have really tight ankles or hips. So in that process, that's why I said, like, I'm thinking about a lot of things. I'm thinking about movement efficiency. I'm thinking about local endurance, and that's kind of like overarching concept of engine all in the same way when I'm assessing someone, because I want to make sure that we're covering all those bases first. Once I see, if let's say someone comes to me, they have really good movement with everything, they are maybe strong enough, but they still feel like I can't breathe, or I feel like my heart rate is just through the roof on everything that I do, that's when we start having the conversation of like, okay, what exactly you're feeling with each of these workouts. And so let's take the open workouts, let's take quarterfinal workouts and break it down that way. But I like to kind of combine both the movement patterns and the way that they're doing those with the concept that they may not be able to breathe or they can't control their heart rate in workouts. And then the second phase of that, this is more performance bias, but I also like to see what the time is when they're doing those workouts. So in other words, if they're doing, let's just say rowing and thrusters, because that's an easy one, I'll time the speed of the thrusters, time the speed of the row, what their average pace is, and compare it to those that are in the sport. This, again, does not address the endurance limitation, but it allows me to see how far away they are from the best in the sport, and then it allows me to figure out how much time I have in the year to address a specific endurance limitation versus like, oh, we just need to learn how to move thrusters a little bit faster in a specific workout like this.
Yeah, I tend to think about that as that you said specific endurance limitation, right? That to me is their ceiling, right? So you test someone and you're checking, all right, your thruster speed is just a little bit too slow. Like let's use, thruster row. You're holding 155 pace and you need to be holding 151 pace for this 15-minute test. And your thrusters, to do 10 thrusters, it's taking you 30 seconds, and we need that closer to 25 seconds. And we do some intervals of that, and we can get them a little bit closer. Say they're 27 seconds, they're holding 153, not 135. That would be really impressive. Okay, so now we've got them a little closer, but there's not really any more room to clean up their mechanics or to clean up their row technique or clean up their thruster. Now we're starting to say, all right, let's look at building some capacity.
100%.
Let's look at building some cardiorespiratory endurance or building some stamina. And I think for those athletes, once you've gotten to that point, the next step is taking on some lower intensity aerobic work to actually build their ceiling, to actually start to raise that level.
Yeah. Before we do that, real quick, just so we can put a bow on that last part, is there any kind of like easy thing that they can go do and try to test at home for themselves? Or is it a little more complicated where you can't just give them hey, go try this? Is there anything like, do you get what I'm asking?
To test, to see if they're
enduring? Which camp you're in?
Yeah, that's actually really tough. I think a test that comes to mind for me would be the row wall ball test from the Open. You remember which one I'm talking about? 19.1, which was it 19 calories row?
Yeah, 15-minute AMRAP, 19 cal row, 19 wall ball.
Yeah.
Well, let's just caveat it. We would say, I'm guessing you guys would say something like, yeah, doing this one test is not going to be enough. And if you had me as a coach, I'd walk you through a variety of tests. But if we were only going to do 19.1, how can I figure out where I might be?
Do the test and pay close attention to, number one, you need to have a score, because you need to figure out if your score is even relevant, right? Because if it's not, then there may be other factors at play. Like, for example,
I need to have a score.
So you need to go through the test and compare your score to the leaderboard in 19.1. And if you need to be competitive with the level of athlete you're trying to compete with, like if you want to be a games athlete, well, you better be in the top, 100 in the world at the end of that test.
You need 10 plus rounds.
Yeah. And if you're not, then the first thing you should probably look at is technique, your wall ball technique, your row mechanics, right? Like Brannen said, that's like our first layer. But then you've done the test now, and then you can get an assessment of how did it feel? What did you feel limited by? When in the workout did you feel like you hit the wall? If you did hit the wall, if you didn't and you got the top score in the world, well, you probably don't need to listen to this podcast. Yeah, you move on. Go focus on your strength, because that's probably your limiter then. Yeah. But yeah, I think that would be a really good way to test it. And you're going to know, like, okay, every time I was on the rower, I just felt like I was blowing up. My legs never recovered from, 10 minutes on the wall ball. Probably a stamina issue. Okay. Vice versa. You're 12 minutes in and you're like, I literally could not breathe. I was having to break the wall ball because I felt like I was suffocating, right? Those are two very different limiters. And anybody who tests this, if we had 10 different people test it, 5 are going to say one thing and 5 are going to say another. And that does allow you to kind of differentiate between the two potential limiters.
Sorry, I got another question, and sorry if this is annoying, but I'm guessing that people at home will have similar questions. So if I'm doing that test, I'm going to go out there and try it. And I'm going to figure out which camp I'm in. And I know my caveats that this isn't the end all be all, and y'all probably have me do other stuff to say for sure. But if I'm doing that, now my next question is, well, what about my execution? What if I'm Mr. Goes Out Hot guy? Does that impact the results? Like, how does that affect?
That's a good question, because it can impact the test.
Baby.
There are people that don't warm up well and just jump into maybe a workout that's that high powered, even more high powered, that just experience local fatigue immediately, but they may not necessarily just be a stamina limited athlete. So in other words, if I just go out there right now and I do, 21-15-9 bike erg, or let's say echo bike and thruster, it's just going to be my legs that blow up if I don't do any warm up.
Sure.
Right? Like, yes, I'm going to be breathing hard, but the first thing I'm going to report is my legs.
You are.
Yes.
But for me, it's going to be that I'm suffocating.
Yeah, but well, that's true. Some people may just automatically report legs when it's not just a stamina limitation, though.
Yeah.
So yes, warm up well. Yes, make sure that you have a good pacing plan. Don't just kill yourself. But in most cases, I think that people are going to warm up for a workout like that, and then you're going to be able to report what's actually going on.
Yeah, I think a test like that would be something that would allow you to really determine what camp you're in, and from there, and like you said, all those caveats. Remember that you're not entirely in one camp or the other, unless you were like a marathoner or a power lifter. Like those would be the only ways that I could imagine someone would be entirely in one camp or the other.
And before you jump into the next part, when people find out which camp they're in, and they come to you and they already know, or say you determine which camp they're in, is there one where you're like, I'd way rather see that than the other?
Brannen?
Like, please just be this.
And this again is it all to me. I think what's more important is how well they move and what their strength numbers are. So just because like the sport, you can get away with not being as enduring as other people. You can get away with not having as much stamina, as Kyle's using that term. I always say just like local endurance, by being better at certain skills or just being really strong.
Do you agree with that, Kyle?
Especially with the bias in the sport.
With the bias that we've seen in the sport now, yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
I think if you rewind 2 years ago, I maybe wouldn't agree with that.
Yeah. I just think that it comes down to movement economy more so than just someone's endurance. Because here's the reality.
To be clear, I don't disagree with that statement at all.
Here's the thing, is that the endurance tests that happen in the Open and in quarterfinals and even semifinals aren't legit endurance tests if we're thinking about like a long triathlon or a half marathon. Like we're not doing actual endurance tests, and most people are still limited by the specific bottleneck that's in the workout. So
we've seen a couple of caveats to that, or a couple of things that go against that just this year. So I think in the Open, the shuttle run burpee pull-up, the burpee pull-up is potentially a skill and efficiency bottleneck, but it's a very small.
The year's 2023 if you're listening to this in the future.
Yeah. It's a very small bottleneck relative to, like thruster mechanics.
So here's a better example to it though. If we did the first Open workout, 23.1, yes, you have to have a base level of endurance, but I can get away with just being really good on the row, just as far as technique goes, and be a little bit slower than other people. Really good at toe to bar and not be as enduring. This is the way that I get away with being doing well in CrossFit workouts still, because I still have the skills of those movements. Now, that is not going to take me from where I'm at to a games level, but I'm just talking about the person that's listening to this podcast that wants to be a little bit better at the sport, go do some local competition.
For sure.
You need to be good at the skills, to me, first and foremost, and then you just layer in the endurance work. Now, if you want to be a high-level performer, which I think is kind of where you're thinking, then we'll talk about what to do for endurance.
Yeah, I think the other place that I think we saw a true endurance test was in age group semifinals with the row. Now, granted, you had to have really good skills just to get to age group semifinals, but once you got there, we had this row double under shuttle run test, and it really is just a test. Now, granted, there's mechanics to shuttle runners, just shuttle runs, and mechanics to double unders and rowing and all that, but really that's the closest to a true endurance test that we've seen in sort of the CrossFit qualifying.
Yeah, and strange that they only put that in the age group, which is a completely different topic. But yes, I agree with you.
Would have been a great test in semifinals.
I agree. Chris, did that answer your question? I don't even remember what your question was. Do you remember what your question was?
Chris ran away from his bike.
Changing cameras.
Well, I think this is a good topic though, because Kyle and I would disagree on kind of that main point.
Well, the reason I was asking
okay.
if he agreed was because I was about to say, wow, look at these two coaches. They're overemphasizing that part of the order of operations, let's say, so that if you clicked on this episode and you were like, man, my endurance, it'd be a kind of a reality check that like, yeah, you might need to shore it up, but sounds like that's probably not the low-hanging fruit.
The most important thing to being a successful CrossFitter at any level of the sport is movement economy, period. That's like the most basic. Someone who's...
Y'all want to stop this and do a movement economy?
We've
talked about that. Yeah.
Economy podcast.
So, all right, let's go back to now we found which one we are.
Right. And now we have to actually start building our ceiling, because with the best movement economy, if you have two athletes with the same level of fitness, the same level of endurance, then the one with better endurance wins. And so we're talking about people who are competing at the quarterfinals level or the semifinals level, whether that's age group or beyond, or even potentially up at the games level. Right. This is where your engine really does start to matter, because across the board, everyone has not the same movement economy, but relatively more similar movement economy.
It definitely gets more dialed in, especially with those that are just experienced and they understand, like, well, they test squatting a lot. They test overhead, snatches and gymnastics and handstand walking. So I need to be good at overhead. So I agree there. You talked about this before we got on the podcast. This is something that you had to do this past year, and you kind of experimented with some different concepts of how to build your endurance. So I actually think we should start there and then kind of talk about some ways that athletes that maybe come from an enduring background versus like a power-based background can approach their endurance training.
What is it that he had to do? Build endurance?
Oh, sorry. Yes. He wanted to build his endurance.
As crazy as this is, with, a 20-year endurance, you would consider swimming an endurance sport, that I came up through that into CrossFit. You'd think, like, man, he's got all this cardiorespiratory endurance or all this cardiovascular endurance. And I was a sprint swimmer. I swam for between 19 and 40 some seconds in most of my races. So, like, I did not build a lot of cardiovascular endurance. I built a lot of stamina, power, speed, all of those things, which they definitely help in CrossFit. But also at the same time, every workout that fell between 9 minutes and 24 minutes, which it turns out is most of the tests in the qualifiers, right? I'd be fine when I get to a live event, but all the qualifiers, man, I would just get my ass kicked. And I've been in this for 12 or 13 years at this point.
And what did it feel like doing the workouts? Was it just like, I can't breathe?
It's always, I can't breathe. Like, it would never be like, oh, my legs are so blown up from these wall ball that I can't do
you could do another rep. You just can't breathe good enough to continue.
My legs could do another rep. My arms could do another rep. I literally just couldn't breathe. Right. That was it. And so
when that happens, what happens? You just stop working or slow down more than you want?
You have to stop until your heart rate comes down, your breathing comes down to the point where you can start working again. And it's not like it's never you're doing thrusters and like my legs are blowing up. It's like I'm doing thrusters and I feel like I'm suffocating. Like, that's the best. I've said that a bunch of times, but like, people who have a cardiovascular limitation will know exactly what I'm talking about.
Here's a question for you. When you discovered that and you're like, man, this sucks, I keep getting stuck up by this, did you ever have a hard-headedness where you're like, all right, screw it, I'm going to just push through the pain because I'm tough? And what happened when you did?
Yeah, of course I did, or else I wouldn't have been doing it for like 10 plus years trying to get better at it. Like, my thought was, okay, I need to figure out how to replicate that feeling over and over and over and just push through it and learn to push through it. Okay, I did that for 10 years and it didn't work. At some point, like, the light bulb's got to go off that what I'm doing is not working.
Yeah. So this goes back to that first example. This is a problem, right? The person comes in the sport and they test, let's just say, let's go back to row thruster, 30, 20, 10 row cows and thrusters would be gross, right? You do it and you get halfway through and you are feeling that suffocation. So you're like, I need to get better at this test. I'm going to run intervals of it, which we do. Like, people need to practice the sport and do interval training of specific movements. But if that's the only thing you're doing, you test it again and you get a couple seconds better, but the same feeling comes up. You're like, I feel like I'm hitting my ceiling and I'm reaching to the highest level of performance that I can get to, but I can't get any better.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is you can do that for 10 years.
Right.
And it's still not going to get any better. You might get a little bit faster, but it's still not going to get better. That's not a solution to that problem.
So the speed, the where you're getting faster, maybe you get a little bit better at movement speed, your transitions improve, maybe you figure out how to breathe a little bit better in a thrust or something like that, but you're just saying, like, that actual ceiling, you're not raising it by doing just intervals all the time.
There's a limit to how much pain you can tolerate. Like, you're not going to, like, miraculously double your pain tolerance or double your, anaerobic capacity. Like, those things don't just miraculously double even with 10 years of training.
Yeah.
Right. If you're someone who's experienced in a sport, it's not like you're going to miraculously make all this progress instantaneously. So, like, my solution was to go back to the drawing board, like to go back and be like, all right, what have I missed in my CrossFit career? What have I missed in my training? And, like, the reality is, while I've done some longer endurance tests, I've never done longer endurance training. So I had done,
Why do you think that was?
Because I was a sprinter. I was fast. And so when you're fast,
Well, I mean,
people who aren't
is it because
fast,
you didn't enjoy it? You thought you overlooked it because you were too cool for it?
Brannen gets it because he was, he was a high level football player. He's a football player and at high level in college. And like he was explosive and fast. And when you're fast, it feels good to go fast. It does not feel good to run at this slow slogging pace for a long time when you know you can go fast.
It also makes you feel like you're not doing a lot of work, which is a huge misconception, right? I had this struggle when I got out of college because I did want to do all the explosive stuff. And thankfully I slowed myself down, but I would go on like these easy jogs and I was trying to follow this program. It's like I'm not doing anything.
Yeah.
I felt like I wasn't getting any better. And then I went back to I'm just going to do hard intervals of this and beat myself down all the time.
And what it finally took was me going back and starting from scratch, going back to zone 2 work, basic, like low intensity zone 2 work. And
give us an example of
Well, hold on. Here's what's so frustrating about this is that I've known this and prescribed this to my athletes.
Yeah, for sure.
Forever.
We're coaches.
Yeah, we've heard you talk about it for years. Yeah.
I do the same thing.
But I didn't do it myself because, I wanted to do, I wanted to get tougher.
So that's the overarching message right there. The message within the message, people, is like, hey, it's going to take you 10 years of beating your head into a wall until you finally care.
Exactly.
Or you're going to listen to this podcast, but it's, come back to it in 10 years.
What's the old saying?
Care.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. Or you can listen to the sage advice that I'm about to provide to you, which is go back to the basics. Spend time doing low intensity work. And I thought about it like this.
Hold on, define zone 2 real quick.
Okay, I will. Yeah. I will. I'll get there. All right. So I was like, all right, first off, I need to go and do stuff that I can do for a really long time because I have to build some cardiovascular endurance that lasts longer than the 9 minutes that I can make it in a Metcon. So what I did is I was like, all right, I'm going to do zone 2. And zone 2 is a very low intensity heart rate. It's based on a 5-zone heart rate model. All right. So zone 1 for most of us is like you're doing a brisk walk. All right. Your heart rate for me, my heart rate goes up to about 110 beats per minute.
And what do they base those zones on? They base it off your heart rate,
your max,
and age?
Your max heart rate. So it's not based on age. So you can do an age predicted max, but all of us that are CrossFitters that have, a Whoop or a heart rate monitor or anything like that, we know our max heart. We have a max heart rate
subscription.
Yep. You have a max heart rate, right? And so everything's going to be based on your max heart rate. Mine's like 191. It's the highest I've seen since I've been, older. It's been way higher when I was younger, but your max heart rate does decrease with age. So that's why they do the age predicted.
Right.
But anyway.
And it's relatively accurate for those that don't have a max heart rate, but it would be better to do a test or have a monitor that you can actually figure that out.
So zone 2, for me, it's anywhere between about 115 to about 132 beats per minute. So it's pretty low. Like you can't do a Metcon and stay in zone 2 unless it's like a super bottlenecked, strict handstand.
You would still
legless.
spike up, but average you would stay in that.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, so I started to think about it and I was like, between all the ergs, I can hold that heart rate forever on a Concept 2 bike. That's not a big deal. So I probably shouldn't spend that much time on a Concept 2 bike. That's also pretty easy to do on a rower, but I'm not even sure that I could run for more than a minute or two slow enough or relaxed enough to stay within that zone. So that was my zone 2. That was my thought process.
Can you now?
Oh, I can now. But
you can run at zone 2?
Dude, I'm not kidding you. I started this.
What does it look like?
I started this in December with running 60 seconds and then walking for 30 seconds and doing that for 30 minutes. And my goal was to keep my heart rate in zone 2. And I built that up from 60 seconds, 30 seconds, all the way up to 4 minutes and 30 seconds. And that took me all the way.
So you would then do 4 minutes of running and you would actually still only be in zone 2, never spilling into 3?
Yeah.
How the hell? What does that look like? Are you going like 0 miles an hour?
It took me, at the end of the progression, right before age group semi, which is the last time I really ran, which I shouldn't have taken all that time off, but I did.
You'll build it back.
Yeah, I'll build it back eventually. I was running 7:30 pace on the assault runner, the fast assault runner, 7:30 pace, keeping my heart rate around it would peak around 136.
Yeah.
Going 4 minutes on, 30 seconds walk.
So this kind of brings up the topic that I started with, in that the way you have to think about endurance too is going to be machine and movement dependent. There may be one that's like a huge limitation. For most people, that probably is running because we're just inefficient at it. We're kind of like clod hopping our way through a run. we don't know how to breathe properly. We don't have good arm swing mechanics. All those things can kind of play with where your heart rate goes. And so learning how to be efficient there is obviously a benefit in case a run comes up, but it can also just help you overall with everything else. Kind of bleeds down into all these other movements that you'll do in the sport.
So the other reason I chose running is because last year, I say traditionally, but we've only had the shuttle runs for a year, but in the shuttle run events from 2022, I just gotten my ass handed to me. Like those were hard for me. And then in the open, it highlighted it even more. Like that workout was that open shuttle run,
burpee pull up
was horrible for me. And so I had a feeling that we were going to see more shuttles. We did. We got a mile of shuttles in age group semifinal or age group quarters, and then a half mile in age group semifinals. And given how bad my performance was, because this was right at the beginning of me starting this progression back in, in February when we did the open, I was expecting that my age group quarter shuttle workout was going to be one of my worst ones. It was my best finish. And I was like, So I just, in that span of time, 2.5 months or 3 months, I was able to go from this being my worst finish ever in the open, in an open workout, to this is my best finish in age group quarters. And it was a mile of shuttle runs, all because I made one decision, which was to start accumulating a lot of zone 2 running volume.
Yeah, let's dive back into that. So what did that look like?
So real quick before you start, I pulled this up. That's why I was on my phone for those that are watching this. But this is one of the cool charts that everyone, if you can even see it in the camera.
You got one of those stupid screens that blocks
Oh, that's true. Yeah, you won't even be able to see it. Well, anyhow, we do have an RPE chart that we give to all of our athletes. And we do this intentionally because we want them to be able to know exactly where their zone should be. And there's also an RPE chart for strength training, which we do a lot of for our individual clients and in compete. But this gives the client the opportunity to be able to kind of learn where each of those zones should be, as opposed to like you hear zone 2 and everyone's like, oh, I'm going to do zone 2. And then they just jump on a bike and they think it's just like ride easy. And then the misconception happens where they think they're riding easy, but they're at 150 beats per minute. 'Cause sometimes that feels easy for athletes. So all that to say, if you're in compete, then you have this, or if you're an individual client, your coach can send this out to you. I think it's it's a nice resource to have for an athlete.
So to your point, Chris,
what was my point?
You were asking, where did I start? So I started with the 60 on, 30 off, and my goal was to go for 30 minutes and do that 3 times a week. And so I just added that on top of what I was already doing. Like I was already pretty deep into like a sport-specific CrossFit prep cycle. So I was just getting up early in the morning, fasted, and doing this. I later learned that I probably shouldn't do them fasted because I was a lot faster when I was not fasted, but that's beside the point. So I did that for a week. Then the next week I went to 90 seconds, 30 seconds. And in week 2, I was going like straight out of zone 2 by 15 or 20 minutes in. And so I had to dial back the pace. And by the 3rd set in that week of 90 on, 30 off, I was able to bring the pace back down and stay in zone 2. So like clearly,
and for the people out there, you're watching that via your app or whatever.
My heart rate monitor.
Your heart
rate,
yeah.
And not to be clear, the Whoop does a horrible job of tracking heart rate when you're running. It would be like, you're at 160, now you're at 110. Yeah. I use a Garmin for tracking heart rate during running, and it was way better.
Have you used Andy's app yet?
No, I have not. Maybe I should give it a try.
Give it a try.
Okay. So I did that, and then I built to 2 minutes, and then 2.5, and then 3, 3.5, 4. And I didn't necessarily go up every week. I only went up when I was successfully able to maintain zone 2 for the target duration for all 3 sessions. And I didn't hit 3 sessions in every week. I hit 3 sessions in most weeks. So it was like probably an average of like 2.5 sessions per week, all the way from like late December until age group quarters. And in that span of time, my pace also, so not only was I running longer, because I actually built this up to 40 minutes by the end. When I was at 3.5 and 4 minutes, I was going for 40 minutes instead of 30. Not only was I able to maintain my heart rate in about 136-ish as a peak, I was also able to bring my pace down from like 8.5 minutes when I was first starting down to about 7.5 minutes for the last.
And that's a big difference in a workout.
It was huge. When I was in the middle of longer workouts, I no longer felt like I was limited by breathing. Then in age group semis and quarters, I felt like I was limited by muscular endurance.
Which will eventually happen at some point.
Right.
The more, quote unquote, cardiorespiratory or cardiovascular endurance you get, the more that local limitation is going to show up.
For me, it was really highlighted in the wall facing handstand push-up GHD box jump workout. Well, first off, like the box jumps, my legs didn't really get tired in the way that they normally would because I'd been running, right? So I had all that repetitive bounding. And a year ago, we did all these box jumps in age group quarters. My legs and calves were just absolutely destroyed. And here, I've been doing all this repetitive bounding from running, and my legs were fine. And the other thing is I was flying through the workout and I was fine. I was like, this just feels like I'm doing my zone 2 running. Now, granted, my heart rate was way above zone 2. I had the heart rate stuff from that. And I think we actually talked about that on a previous podcast. It was like, I was probably around 160 or 170 beats per minute, but it didn't feel as uncomfortable as it had in the past. And so
you didn't have that suffocating moment.
Right. And so all of this is to kind of go back and say that a lot of times most people think they need to suffer more, but a lot of it comes down to improving movement economy, like you talked about, which is going to reduce their suffering in the workout because they're moving more efficiently.
Right.
And then going back and doing lower intensity. I mean, none of this starting at 60 seconds on, 30 seconds off. It was never hard. It was just long and slow and kind of boring.
If you didn't have that reason to buy in, you would have still felt like, why am I doing this? I'm not doing any work, quote unquote.
Yeah. I committed to doing a test, and I've coached so many people through this process and told them it's going to take a while. It'll start to feel better, like week 6 or 8, you're going to start to feel it in your Metcons. And, I was like, dude, just listen to your own advice. Listen to what you've told everybody all along.
Was it relieving to know it was true?
Yes.
Hey, it works.
Hey, it actually works.
I've been prescribing crap all these years.
I want to get into kind of like the actual time domains and what you would prescribe to an athlete so the listeners can kind of have some like application of what they can do. But just real quick, kind of 2 things there that I think, the way that I think about it, if I'm prescribing this for someone, number 1, I'm still focused on movement quality. So if let's say it was a running progression, we're doing drills on how to properly arm swing, how to foot strike, what they should be doing with their gait, making sure that we continue to refine that. If it's on the row erg, we'll do things for like different pick drills and how to press away with your legs, what you do with your back, how do you set
with strokes per minute.
All of those things matter too. And I know that this gets into like the nitty gritty and the details, and some people hate that. But like, again, if you want to be a really good athlete, you need to figure out all those details so you can be a better athlete.
To that point, I think I'd be remiss to leave this out. I was working with Ryan Sullivan, our TTT coach, who's our running specialist, and I was sending him one video of my running every week, and he was giving me, they were tiny little minute corrections, but man, they were making a huge difference in keeping my heart rate down at faster paces as I went. So it's not just the like physiological training that made an impact. I also got better at running, the skill of running.
Yeah. And I think that that's just something that people miss. Like, even if they get into it, they just kind of go through the motions and feel like they're going to get better, but you still need to make sure you're layering in movement economy. And the other thing, we already talked about this, but I get how hard it is when it feels like you're not doing much. I battle this even to this day. If I do easy work, I just feel like, I'd be better off just doing a 10-minute AMRAP where it feels hard and I walk away sweaty and whatever. And there are days where maybe that's what you need to do just for your emotional well-being. But if you're taking a long-term approach, the hard road is sometimes the easy work because mentally you have to deal with that.
Yeah, I was talking to my wife about this. I was talking to Haley about it, and we said, I was like, the easiest part of this was just going down there and actually doing the running, like the being in there and doing it.
Yeah.
The hard part was getting myself to do it because it's boring.
I know.
Especially the first few sessions. You say it doesn't feel like you're doing much. When you're only running 60 seconds at zone, trying to stay around a zone 2, and you're walking for 30 seconds, like it literally feels like you're mostly just walking. And those first few sessions felt completely worthless, but it was very clear also that I couldn't run for more than 60 seconds and keep myself in, that zone 2 range.
I think I want to add one more thing to this because I've done this with athletes. Most people can't run for 60 seconds. Most people are more like 30 seconds on, 45 to 60 seconds off their first probably 2 or 3 weeks.
You mean for zone 2?
For zone 2, yeah. You'd be shocked at how hard it is, especially for people that aren't.
Without dipping into zone 3 is
correct,
what you mean.
Correct, yeah, without like their heart rate spiking. So it's even worse than what Kyle's saying because you are basically doing like a really slow jog to a walk. But that's just the starting point. And then over a couple of weeks, you'll see, like Kyle said, that you get a little bit better. You can add some time. Maybe your pace drops a little bit. And that's when it's more rewarding. But you have to kind of plan that long game of like, it's going to be 3 to 4 weeks before you really see some changes here.
I also think there's something to be said for choosing your modality wisely. Like I chose running for a very specific reason because I knew it was going to be the hardest one for me to maintain zone 2. I knew I wanted to get better at shuttle running, and I am a heavier athlete, and so I wanted to make sure that I was working against my body weight. If you think about running versus rowing or echo or ski erg, like your body weight helps you on those ergs, but in running, your body weight is your enemy. And so as a heavier athlete, around the time I started, I was like 208. Like I needed to be working against my body weight. But if you're someone who's a lighter athlete who struggles with, external loads, like maybe the rower would be a better option for you, because then your, light body weight is working against you. Essentially, it's like your disadvantage. And so choose the modality that's going to provide the biggest advantage for you in focusing on it versus choosing the one that you're best at. Most people, or easiest, which is the Concept 2 bike. Like people who are going to listen to this and they're like, I'm just going to go do Zone 2 work on the Concept 2 bike. I promise you, you're not going to get out of it what I just described.
Well, but also let me ask this then. Is that in the mindset with the, what's the word we keep saying, with the caveat being that you're in that upper echelon of, I'm trying to go from up here to just the next step. Now, if we were to reduce that down to a beginner to intermediate, are they going to make significant gains no matter which device they choose?
Probably. I think I would say probably.
So maybe don't get lost in the weeds just yet. Just pick one that you could do consistently.
I would also say, if you're a beginner, really think about what you struggle with more. Are you someone who struggles more with body weight movements like burpees and, double unders and box jumps? If that's the case, running's probably your choice. If you're someone who struggles more with moving external loads, barbells, dumbbells, et cetera, then maybe a row or a ski might be a better option for you.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then the last thing you'd have to think about is how important is the movement that you're practicing. So in other words, like if you just care about the open and it's going to be shuttle runs and rowing, those are the two things that have been tested. Like you're not going to see a ski erg, maybe then you either pick just a row or a run as opposed to doing it on a ski erg. But for most athletes, I think it's just better to be well-rounded and then kind of identify the different machines. You could rotate through them, do 3 months of run, 3 months of row, 3 months of ski, and do it that way too. I think that's a good way to just be well-rounded, feel healthy, feel fit.
One thing to keep in mind as well is that a lot of the adaptations, the stamina adaptations, are movement specific. So like with running, it's going to have some carryover to body weight movements like burpees. It's going to have, because you're jumping. Right. It's going to have carryover to box jumps because you're jumping. It's going to have carryover to double unders because of the bounding, and obviously shuttles because it's running, sort of. We talked about
a shuffle.
Yeah, it's a shuffle. So it's going to have good carryover to those. But the stamina is, the stamina that you build, local muscular endurance, is not necessarily going to help carry over to like your muscle ups or your rope climbs and things like that.
Whereas maybe a ski or a row could help that.
Would likely have some carryover. The ski really taxes the lats and grip, and then the row really taxes the grip and the pullers, as McGoldrick,
the pulling muscles,
the pullers. It really taxes a lot of the pulling muscle, so it might have some carryover to those things. And like ski, I've used Zone 2 ski to improve people's strict handstand push-up capacity. As weird as that sounds. Yeah.
No, it makes sense. You're and anyone that's been on a ski erg knows that their triceps could blow up. Yep. And even just like in general, going from an upper body piece to another upper body piece, I think you're getting a lot of like local occlusion that can happen, and that can help you long term with those things in a performance setting.
So we've talked a ton about building, like my story about building cardiovascular endurance, but there's this whole other realm of building local muscular endurance or stamina that we haven't even touched on at this point.
Yeah.
What's been, as someone who has been, kind of stamina or muscular endurance limited, what's been your experience there?
Yeah, I still think the first step is looking at or addressing the movement limitations. A perfect example of this is a handstand push-up. If someone comes to us and they say they really struggle with handstand push-ups, the first thing we need to look at is, okay, what does the overhead position look like? Yeah. If they don't have good shoulder flexion, good thoracic extension or rotation, the ability to be able to kind of move around with their thoracic spine, it's probably going to be very hard to do a handstand push-up well. The other thing is the strength limitation. This is kind of, if you don't raise the strength ceiling, it's going to be hard to be enduring with something that requires some level of strength.
It's the same concept as building an engine, right? So like if you don't raise the endurance ceiling, correct, building an engine is always going to butt up against the top of your capacity, just like the local muscular endurance or stamina limitations are going to always butt up against your strength or strength endurance.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a perfect example of this is let's say there are 135-pound front squats in a workout, but your max is 155 pounds. The 135 is going to be really hard to move for 21.15.9 of front squats in rowing. But if your front squat max is, 315 pounds, it's going to be a little bit easier, even if you're not necessarily enduring, right? Like it's just a different percentage of your strength. So you need to address those two things first. You need to continue to get stronger, and you need to make sure that your movement quality is good. And we see people all the time that come into the sport, especially with the overhead position. I honestly think that it's more important to have a better overhead position than a squat position. You can almost manipulate or get away with a bad squat position, but like if your ankles are tight, open up your hips a little bit, widen your stance, whatever. You can
wear
get away
some
with it.
Versa lifts.
Exactly. But if your shoulder flexion is bad, or you can't get into a good front rack. It just takes a long time to develop good positions there.
Yeah, and it's hard to get dumbbells where they're supposed to be. If you're push pressing them or doing thrusters with them, and even worse if you have to hold them overhead to do walking lunges and things like that. But I think once you've addressed some of the movement limitations, and once you've addressed the strength limitations, there's definitely things that you can do to build stamina. Like a real simple example is a lot of people in the sport are like, man, push-ups. Push-ups are really hard because we don't, in competitive CrossFit, we don't do a lot of push-ups because they're not specifically tested.
Right.
But like you can see massive gains in push-ups by just doing some max rep sets of push-ups.
Yeah.
Accumulate 100 in fewest sets as possible. Every time you break, jump on a Concept 2 bike for a minute and easy spin. Right. Very simple, very structured. And, the next week you do 110, then you do 120, 130. You can build a massive level of stamina like that. But one thing to keep in mind is that those muscular endurance adaptations that you make are very specific to the movement. So that's not necessarily going to carry over to your handstand push-ups because, well, a push-up is more pec and tricep and anterior shoulder, and a handstand push-up is more anterior shoulder, middle, middle delt and tricep.
So depending if someone is tricep limited versus maybe, shoulder versus pec, depending on the movement. But
for sure.
Yeah.
Dang, Chris.
The loud sneeze over there.
Really? I moved the microphone. Y'all heard it?
Oh, yeah, we picked it up.
I think there are a couple different ways that you look at local endurance, too, based on performance limitations, or that's probably not the right way to say it. I'm looking at someone in a workout, and I want to address the combinations that may come up just as much as just the movement is
right.
You know what I mean? So if I'm looking at a workout where it is ski-erg into strict handstand push-ups and someone gets crushed by it, well, what's going on there versus if it's handstand push-ups and double unders and they feel more confident with that. So there are a lot of different things you have to look at as an athlete. But from the basic level, we want to make sure that someone can get in the positions. Someone has the strength to do it. Before they do butterfly pull-ups, I want to make sure they can do strict pull-ups, so on and so forth. So that was kind of like the base level. Once we kind of layer on top of that, I kind of think about it in a couple different ways. One, I like to layer in a lot of what I'll call that structural strength and endurance work first. If you're in Compete, you've seen a lot of this over our kind of no limit cycle. This is the time where we are addressing the limitations, the most common limitations that have come up in the sport. And one of those is handstand push-ups or muscle ups. So like for muscle ups, we don't just want to do muscle ups. We want to work on the support hold. We want to work on the bottom of ring dip hold. We want to work on a false grip position to make sure that you are strong in all of these different positions that may come up in the muscle up. And then in another day of the week, or maybe in another, a subsequent cycle, then we'll start adding in the movement by itself. So we want to address a muscle up or a handstand push up, and you will do those big sets. You would rest and go on the bike until you can do another big set. And like maybe it's 50 for time in sets of 10 unbroken. And then eventually we would add in some respiratory fatigue or some additional local fatigue. That may be the ski erg now mixed in with the handstand push-up, or a bike into a handstand push-up. And then we add in the chaos eventually towards the sport-specific time of the year, which is the double under into dumbbell snatch into handstand push-up.
Yeah, I think to that point, like if you think about each of the different phases, so this is obviously very different than zone 2. Zone 2, it's like, hey, here's your linear progression. And you're just going to add a little bit of time as you go. Maybe start with, start easy and work your way up. With these, it's different because, you're really trying to start by addressing, like you said, the structural strength. So in my mind, you want to improve someone's handstand push-ups. It might be a cycle where you start with a wall-facing handstand hold for max duration, kick down, rest 30 seconds. Then you go, a 75-pound bar behind the neck snatch grip press, because that's a pretty similar grip width and movement pattern to a strict handstand push-up, but the weight is way lower. And then finishing with overhead tricep extensions and do a couple rounds of that circuit. So you're building structural strength. You're strengthening all the muscles that are going to help you perform a handstand push-up. And then you go into that second phase where you are starting to add, handstand push-ups under some volume in isolation. Then you're adding in some pre-fatigue before, and then you're adding them into Diane.
Right. Yeah. So it's basically this very foundational base kind of concepts, and we want to make sure that you're good and we talked about this in a previous podcast, but we want to make sure that you're safe when you're doing the movements. Like, this is one of my biggest pet peeves with CrossFit, is that people jump in right into muscle ups. Like they've never done maybe any support work for a ring muscle up, but they jump in, they do a muscle up, and that's awesome. Yeah, you got a PR. But also the risk of injury there is much higher than it otherwise would be if you built kind of like the the structural strength that's needed to be able to do that well. And then the next thing is I think people jump into Metcons right away without building it into kind of that pre-fatigue setting. So in other words, you're just hitting your ceiling. Like I can do 20 handstand push-ups and then I'm completely blown out. Well, if there's 35 in a Metcon, you get to 20 and you're just bottlenecked. Whereas we could build you up to that volume by doing 35 or 40 and then get you to 45 and then 50, where it's just handstand push-ups first, and that'll eventually allow you to be able to kind of do a Metcon without that bottleneck.
Yeah, I think a lot of people miss the bridge there where they are, they do the isolation work, the structural strength work, then they do handstand push-ups in isolation, then they put them in Metcons. And what they miss is the 10-minute EMOM where your odd minutes are max handstand push-ups in 30 seconds and your even minutes are 15 or 12 calories ski.
Right.
Which is tough, but it's creating that kind of mixed pre-fatigue, but it's also in a controlled setting. Like you're only doing 30 seconds of handstand push-ups. You're doing as many as you can in that 30 seconds. I feel like that chunk in the middle gets missed so much, especially when people are trying to kind of create their own training program and even analyzing some other training programs out there. I think that component, which does allow you to take all this stuff that you built, all this local muscular endurance that you built and put it in a Metcon, that's the bridge piece that people seem to miss all the time.
Yeah, I agree. It just made me think, what do you think changes though with the way that programming happened this year? So you still need endurance, like local endurance, because you saw in quarterfinals the handstand push-ups, but it's almost like very severe bottlenecks with the rope climbs. Or does that change the way you think about programming for those stamina-based? It has.
Movements? So you and I were talking about some of the little circuits that I've been doing, and they've really just been since age group semifinals, but like individual semifinals reinforce this for me even more, where I'm trying to concentrate pressing endurance into one thing. Because if you look, pressing endurance was just absolutely annihilated in quarterfinals test 1 with those strict handstand push-ups after all of that handstand walk-in. Same thing, you do all that pulling work, the deadlift and the bar muscle-ups on the final test into all those rope climbs. And then you saw the same thing at semifinals. So clearly there is this bias towards, as you put it, really dense local muscular endurance. It's severe.
Yeah. And like a more complex movement with the wall facing or at semifinals, the seated rope climbs. Like it's almost adding a layer of complexity that makes it even harder to do the movement.
So an example of that would be, I just did this circuit yesterday where it was, I think I did 4 rounds of this. And it was, 15 double dumbbell bench press, 50 pounds into 10 push press at 155, right into max rep tricep press downs. Cause I wanted to do ring dips, but I was so fatigued by that point.
I was doing push downs.
I was like, I'm going to tear a pec. So I chose to do tricep press downs. But if you think about what that is, it's taking all of the pressing movements, all the major pressing movements in the sport, and just kind of packing them into one thing with the goal of building muscular endurance and stamina in all those patterns. And that could be progressed in so many different ways. You can increase the volume of each of the movements, moving your way up to 20, dumbbell bench press and 15 push press, and then just keep increasing your max rep set of tricep press downs. Or you can make it more sport specific, adding, push-ups at the end instead of tricep press downs, or you can increase the load. That gives you so much flexibility. And I think, I actually saw some of that stuff in the Compete RX program over the last month. And I was like, I know where they're going with this, and I need to be stealing some of this because that's what's being tested now.
Yeah. To give the listeners an example, we're doing a handstand push-up progression right now, and it's 3 to 5 sets depending on the level. So we have different paths, right? The intermediate maybe is doing a few less sets. The elite athletes maybe are doing 5 total sets, which is a ton of volume. So step into this carefully, but it would be 5 bench press at a specific load, rest 30 seconds into a 50-foot handstand walk for speed. You're trying to go as fast as you possibly can, rest 30 seconds, and then 1 minute AMRAP of strict handstand push-ups. To progress that, or if you want to add more volume to it, you obviously can, but to make it more complex, it'd be wall facing the next week. For the elite athletes, maybe it's a 1-inch deficit wall facing, then 2-inch or parallel. Yeah, there are all these different ways, but the nice thing about those training progressions, because it's an AMRAP at the end, is we can regulate the volume for the type of athlete. So instead of saying 25 strict handstand push-ups at the end, which we will eventually, everyone's going to have to do a set number like we saw in quarterfinals, we can give someone an AMRAP at the end, or just like a 1-minute clock, or AMRAP in time remaining. That allows the best athletes to still express themselves and get a lot of volume, because and elite, we saw numbers at like 35 handstand push-ups in a minute after all that work. But then the athletes that aren't as good maybe hit their number of 8 to 10, which is still great. Like we're still improving their ability to do handstand push-ups under fatigue. And again, there's so many different ways you can progress that. But that's just like one simple example of what we're doing in Compete.
Well, I think that really highlights how different the types of endurance in the sport are. You know, we've talked about two completely separate things. Someone who's good at what you just mentioned, right? Bench press into handstand walk into handstand push-up. That is endurance, right? That's pressing endurance. And it's just as important in the sport as the cardiovascular endurance. But
at the highest level, do people lean one way or the other?
No, they're balanced. At the highest level, the people are fucking great at both.
Yeah.
Period. Like they have developed both ends of that.
There will be people that get into the games that may have a bottleneck, but that just gets exposed over 15 tests.
Yeah, I think the person who wins the CrossFit Games has built both pieces of this,
Correct.
Plus strength, plus a little bit of speed. They're not usually the fastest out there, but
speed
they're fast.
Relative to the people that
to
are
CrossFit.
there. Yeah,
speed relative to CrossFit, and they've built all of it, and that takes time, which is part of the reason I'm still kicking myself for not having started these zone 2 progressions earlier in my career. Cause it was like, damn, 12 years in, I should have been doing this. Cause I've been doing the stamina and handstand pushup. You and I were coming up with these protocols in like 2014, 2015.
Here's a question for zone 2 work. If you're trying to improve, sometimes in training, when you put things in, you got to take other things out. For zone 2 work, is that true? Like what?
It's a good question. Damn, Chris, you're on it.
Crushing it today.
Yeah. I did not take anything out. I just layered on that zone. I got up earlier and layered zone 2 on. I was like, it's going to be 45 minutes. I don't have to warm up. I walk my first interval every time. So like there's no warm up for it. You just get into it and get it done. A lot of that's going to be time dependent. If someone has the time in the day to add zone 2 training in, it shouldn't detract from anything. The only thing I will say is that by doing it in the morning, I did notice that my Metcons in the middle of the day they definitely suffered. Like I was noticeably fatigued in them, but I understood that. And so I just accepted that was going to take a hit, and that when I took away the zone 2 volume during my taper, that the Metcons were going to come back, and they did.
Yeah.
And also keep in mind, people listening, that Kyle, while he is a father of 2 and he definitely doesn't have the easy life, you're not at a 9-to-5 job all the time.
No.
So you're not squeezing this in at the end of your day or at the beginning and then being stressed out.
He can make his own schedule.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, I have cut other things out, but that's just because of the nature of where I'm at right now. We just had a newborn. So I usually will do just like one day of zone 2, and it has been running actually. Most of mine is still walking. I mean, that's what I do. And that's fine. But
do you remember Scott Hagness?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
so I actually reached out to him a little bit about zone 2 because
Nice.
he's really, really into using zone 2 for improving CrossFit. And I talked to him a bit about this. And one of the things he said is that most CrossFitters he's worked with need to start with like loaded walking, rucks, weight vests, and just walking, because they're not going to be able to even run for 30 seconds or 60 seconds at zone 2. But by adding some load, you can get their heart rate a little bit closer to that zone 2, or even into zone 2 while walking. Do that for a couple weeks, then you can take the vest off and they can start running.
If anyone wants to join my cat backpack club, and Rick go on walks all the time.
Well, we actually are starting a ruck club. I'm being dead serious.
You're going to get a cat?
I kind of like this idea.
No, not a cat. Well, we talked about yesterday. We're going to do a 12-mile in under 3 hour, which is the military uses that, right?
I'm in.
Yeah, I think that would be a great way. And I agree with you. That's something that I've
was
used in
this
the past.
your pitch to get me into your ruck club?
Exactly.
No, forget the 5'11" weight vest. Let's all go kitty bags.
I'll pass on the cat bag.
Yeah, no.
Come on.
So 35-pound ruck, 12 miles in under 3 hours, but we'll train for it. So, I don't think many people could do that easily
without
right now.
training.
Yeah, it's very, very, I mean, that's 15 minutes.
35 pounds in a ruck is way heavier than most people think. I did something for the classroom a while back that was on loaded running and rucking, and man, some of the potential value for cross training, like doing zone 2 work in CrossFit running, if you can get to the point you can run zone 2 with a 20-pound vest, I'd be willing to bet that some of the top level CrossFitters are doing that as part of their supplemental training.
Get to the point where you can run zone 2 with a weighted vest. What is it about that that's hard? So let me assume the answer here, because my guess is being able to slow down or why is that hard? Because to me, I would say I would always just quickly spill into zone 3. So what is my heart adapting, or am I learning how to regulate my speed better to stay in zone? What's happening?
Well, a little bit of all of the above, but when you throw a ruck or a vest on, it compresses the chest wall. So less blood comes back to the heart. And when less blood comes back to the heart, your heart rate automatically goes up, right? So like you have to keep, this is going to get real complex in the weeds, but you have to keep cardiac output stable in order to meet the demand of exercise. Your body adapts.
So it's by paying attention to it and pulling back and
staying within the zone. And you can give yourself a little bit of leeway. Like you don't have to be like, I'm going to stay directly in zone 2.
Okay, I dipped into zone 3 for a couple seconds. Now I'm back.
You're fine, right? You're fine. You're 5 beats per minute over your zone 2. You're fine. You're not ruining your
mainly
your
looking at
session.
Accumulated time in said zone that you're targeting.
Yeah.
I think the problem is most people think they're in zone 2, but they're well above that for sustained periods of time. That's what I meant earlier when I was like, hey, most people think that this is too easy, so they go a little bit harder, and then it's not the same. Your intention is there, but it's not actually working out the way that you think it is.
I think also another thing we should very quickly discuss, since we're back on the topic of zone 2, and that is targets, like weekly total volume targets. And I think
I meant to ask you that.
This is actually something I talked to Scott Hagnes about, and he was suggesting 2.5 hours for what he said elite level CrossFitters.
Over a week.
Yes, over a week. 2.5 hours accumulated over a week. So if you really think about it, it's only 5 days of 30 minutes. That's not that bad.
But for the average person, so for me, I'm training 30 minutes a day. Like that's we talked about this, but I'm for those that are listening, like I'm not going to stick to this forever. But for the next couple of months, we just had a newborn. Like I said, I get in, get out. Basically, my training session is actually 20 minutes, 5-minute warm up, 5-minute cool down, and I'm out. I can't do that unless all of it was zone 2. So for someone like me, is it okay if I'm doing, 1 or 2 sessions a week?
So one of the questions I asked Scott, and I think this is important for people to understand, is that it can be chunked into 3 10-minute, you have 10 minutes after we get done with this podcast. Right. You could go throw a ruck on and walk for 10 minutes and you could get yourself into zone 2, and that's going to count towards your accumulated time. And so it really depends on what people's schedule is like. That might mean you wake up 20 minutes early and do 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes after you get the kids to bed. It just depends on what's available to you and what your priorities are.
Free advice for someone out there. You got like the knees over toes guy.
Yeah.
We need a female out there to become the zone 2 boo.
Wow.
Go ahead and get the IG handle and just, teach everybody. Ain't nobody trying to listen to your ass or Scott Hagnett, whoever you're talking about.
I'll let Scott know that he should pursue
that. He could be the zone 2 boo.
He could be the zone 2 boo.
I guess it could be a guy. Why does it have to be a female?
Yeah, I don't know.
Fuck that.
Scott, you're the zone 2 boo.
What about the athlete that trains twice a day? What if they started with 15 minutes and 15 minutes each day? Is
you
that
already
possible?
know the answer to this, Brannen.
Just answer the question.
Yeah. That's actually one of the strategies I've used for years, giving zone 2 to people while not doing it myself, is for especially like gym owners, gym managers, people that are coaches. Man, chunk 10 minutes at the beginning of your workout, 10 minutes at the end of your workout. If you're doing 2 sessions, you're getting 40 minutes of zone 2 in per day. Do it, one of them on the assault bike, one of them on the runner, one of them on the ski erg, one of them on the rower. You'll be good at all the ergs.
Yeah. Now, to wrap all of this up, I think it is important to note that based on our experience, we have seen many athletes that start the sport that have a huge strength deficit that they also need to address. And so if that's you, make sure that you're working with a coach to help that, because that has become a huge bias in the sport.
Yeah. If you want to sabotage your strength progress, the most effective way to do that is to do zone 2 running. So take everything. I hope people listen this far into this.
Yeah, they cut it off.
Hold on, what'd you just say? Run it back.
Okay. If you have a big strength deficit in the sport,
it's a large majority of athletes.
Yes. It's half the field.
Yeah.
Right. It's got to be half the field. If you have a big strength deficit, probably the best way to sabotage your strength adaptation is by doing lots of zone 2 running. So everything that I just told you about how it got me so much better, if you're not already pretty high on the strength end of the spectrum, then you probably shouldn't do that.
And
biking is probably your best option.
So earlier we mentioned order of operations, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, so feel free to shoot this down. But do y'all have what that order of operations for the competitive CrossFitter is?
Oh,
well, we can, but just real quick, we were assuming that we were just talking about the person that has the endurance limitation.
Yeah.
So when we said, when we're addressing endurance, we're assuming that person already is strong, like Kyle, and just needed to build their engine.
Yeah. To be clear, the reason I chose to do that is because I tend to finish in, the top.
Yeah,
10,
Kyle's already really, really strong, super powerful. He's fast. So the big limitation, the big hole is the endurance.
Suffocation. No breathing.
God, I hope people get to the end of the episode.
Yeah, I know, right? The hierarchy, all right? Movement quality. Once your movement quality is taken care of, then I would say, depending on your limiter, it's either you build your base strength or you build your base endurance, right? If you're building your base endurance, you probably already have enough strength. So now you're going to start doing sport-specific strength work.
Yep.
If you don't have strength and you already have an endurance bias, you're going to focus on strength, but you're going to do sport-specific endurance work so that you're maintaining your endurance if you're already strong, or you're maintaining your strength if you're already enduring.
Yeah, I mean, so like a Matt Frazier that comes in, who's a great weightlifter, I assume he probably did a lot of endurance, like some very basic, just building his aerobic base.
You want to talk about someone who has said that they've been doing Zone 2 forever? Like, go back and listen to his podcast. How come none of us listened to him? You know what I mean? Like he had something. Oh, I did listen to him as a coach, just not as an athlete.
He did that because he was already snatching 315 pounds. He had a huge squat, so on and so forth. For the athlete on the other side, Jordan Troyan was a great example of this. I mean, I don't know what he's doing now, but he was an excellent endurance athlete.
He's going to come back and compete in a 40-plus Masters next year.
Oh, really? So you talk? Okay, that's awesome. I mean, he was obviously a great swimmer. All the endurance events at the games he would crush, but his strength metrics were a little bit lower than everyone else. He's an athlete that probably would focus more on strength. So you need to still identify like what that limitation is for you. And an easy way to do that is to start on the leaderboard. Just look, if you can't do the 275-pound clean and jerks or the 185-pound clean and jerks in quarterfinals, like you got 5 burpee box jumps and that was it, then that may be something you need to work on.
Look at where your thruster finished this past year.
Yep.
That's such a encapsulating strength test, right? It gets pressing, it gets squatting, and pulling from the floor, all captured into one. Go look at where you finished on that. And if you were really low, well, prioritize strength. If you're pretty high, or if it was your highest finish, well, prioritize endurance.
Now, get on your ergs. What happens, Kyle, for the athlete that did really bad in both portions of that test? They couldn't do the shuttle run and burpee, and they also only had, 150-pound thruster. That's a male.
Join TTT Compete. I'm dead serious. Join TTT Compete. Get in the correct level of the program, whether that's intermediate, so you can learn skills, RX or RX plus, depending on where you're at. But if you're that person who didn't finish well in either one, probably starting in the intermediate path and follow a well-balanced program for years, right? We're talking, I'm telling this story as someone who had been in this for 12 years with an additional 20-year training history, right? Or 15-year training history prior to that. Like, it's not going to happen. None of it is going to happen overnight. And there's so many skills that you have to learn, that you have to build economy in the sport, that all of this stuff is going to take a long time. But you need to focus on economy first, which is why I would recommend for that person to probably start in the intermediate path. Learn the economy, learn all the skills, master those skills, and then worry about your engine and your strength, because that stuff can be built.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a cool thing. We have so many options. If you want an individual coach, your coach will give you an assessment and then obviously take you down the right path. In Compete, we have all those paths. So intermediate is for those that need to work on the skills. We have a strength bias path for the athlete that's been in the sport, but maybe is just a little weak. Like they have all the skills, but it's like, look, my thruster was 185 and I need to get it to 245 or 55 to be competitive.
I want to follow that path.
Yeah,
I want to.
You'd be good at it. And then we also have endurance options in there as well for those that need to build their endurance. So I think that that's kind of the key, is you need to first identify where your weaknesses are and then make sure that you're following the right program for you.
Well said.
I'll clip this in at the front of this podcast too. So if you're hearing it there, this is also at the end. But let's do something different. And for this episode, as you listen to it, come up with some questions, put them down in the comments, and let's come back and do a answer everyone's questions about this episode specifically episode.
I love that.
I like that idea.
That'd give us more structure too. We sat down and just started
because we gave you a lot to chew on. Now, what other questions did you have from it?
Cool. Ask away.
What color is your cat backpack, Chris?
Cat backpack? I'm wanting to say it's like a navy-ish blue, maybe a black. No, it's black.
Do you put a cat in your backpack,
yeah,
or is it just a cat?
Rick
do you have
Miyazaki.
Do you have a cat named Rick?
Ricky Miyazaki. Yeah, he's in there.
I didn't know that.
And he's fat too, so he's like a good little.
Is he 35 pounds? Does he meet the weight requirement?
I would say
chance a cat is 35 pounds.
Why not? You don't think so?
Can we just
is there
put
such
one of
thing
our,
as a 35
all he
pound
does
cat?
is eat all day.
There's no such thing as a 35 pound cat.
Feed me.
Let's look that
Can
up.
we just put one of our kids in the back in like a backpack? Not like a suffocating backpack.
So here's the thing: is to get under 3 hours, you have to average 15 minutes, which means you're not
per
you're
mile.
not walking.
Oh,
yeah,
no,
15 minutes per mile.
That's fast.
You are essentially you want to run the downhills, walk the uphills, and then any flat terrain, you're doing like the
you're talking about for
shuffle.
this challenge we're going to do.
The challenge.
Not
Stay tuned.
What's the date? Like, when are we finishing this?
We were going to ask who wants to do it, and then come up with a training plan.
Me.
Me too. I would love that. That would be like my long day each week. So I could definitely.
I'm going to train for it.
I got to start getting
by
Rick
sprinting
acclimated to the heat.
It is about to
He's
get
an
hot.
AC cat.
Yeah, we're gonna do it over the summer too. So it's gonna be hot.
with a ruck.
Hold on, I have to. You know how I was telling you that my ears are getting bigger? I think.
Yeah.
This
Isn't that
ear,
a true thing as you get
yes,
older?
Yes.
This left ear is hurting me.
I'm in deep trouble.
World's largest cat.
Well, it's like a Bengal tiger or something.
Oh,
Siberian
no. I
tiger.
mean like a domestic cat.
Domestic cat fat.
Well, someone has a domesticated Siberian tiger, so it's the domesticated Siberian tiger.
The Maine
My
Coon.
cat has to be 20 pounds.
The Maine Coon is a friendly fluff monster.
That's what Max has, is a Maine Coon, right?
Oh, is that 11 to 25 pounds?
That's a huge range.
Wait,
The
for the Maine
smallest
Coon,
ones-
it's 11 to
The
25?
Maine Coon is 25 would be the
Rick's
max.
little bitch ass can't be that heavy.
The smallest ones
He's
are
a tiny
half the
cat.
size of the biggest ones. That's the huge range.
Well, that's also human beings.
Yeah, okay.
Think
but
about it.
but we're talking about like one.
All right,
yeah,
folks, thanks for
never mind.
listening.